Hi, I'm Florent Dedier, and this is Taste from the Devs. And if you are here, it's because you want to see more about Richard Ham's interview. But you can see it immediately if you want. But I want to sum up a little bit why this interview exists. Some weeks ago, I made a video on Bubsy 3D and tried to explain why this game was so horrible. And I don't want to make a video about, oh my god, it's the worst game of all the time and blah blah blah. Everybody does it, and I don't want to make it. So I tried to reach some devs that worked on it, and mainly Richard Ham and Mike Berlyn. Unfortunately, Mike Berlyn has passed away when I wrote the episode, so that gave a darker tone at the end of the episode of Bubsy 3D when I pay a tribute to him. And Richard Ham, I sent him an email and he didn't answer me. So I finished the video, I posted it, and some weeks after that, he answered me and said, "Oh, I'm very interested to discuss with on Bubsy 3D and other stuff." And I said, "Oh, we need to have a discussion." And say me, "No, you will send me your questions, and I will send you my answers." So I sent him my questions, and some weeks after that, he sent me his answers in a video when he talked about every question, 27 questions that I asked him. After that, I need to translate everything for French folks, because Taste on the Devs, it's the name is in English, a French YouTube channel about video games. So it was a very, very long time to make it. And finally, you can see that video. If you want to discuss about it, comments below. You can reach me on Twitter. My Twitter is on the front, the YouTube front page if you want to have a chat. And hope you will enjoy it, because it was a very fantastic video when we talked about Bubsy 3D game design, high resolution, a little bit Syphon Filter, a little bit Bubsy 4 and other stuff like this. And it's a very, very, very important video, I think. And if you want to share it, that could be very, very nice, because I think a lot of people need to see this video to know how developing a game between 2D and 3D was so difficult at the time, and not just a question about, oh yeah, devs are lazy or something like this. It's not the case, and it will not be the case, in fact. So enjoy this interview of Richard Ham, junior designer on Bubsy 3D.
All right. First of all, before joining Nintendo, or before joining Eidetic in 1993, I was at Nintendo. What was my job? I was a Nintendo gameplay counselor, which means it was my job to answer the phone when you got stuck at some early NES or Super NES game or a Game Boy game and you had no idea what to do. Because this was back in the late 80s and early 90s, and there was no internet that people could go and look up answers to questions. So they would literally call me. I worked from 4 a.m. until 1 p.m. and just answered phones all day, guiding people through games, which meant I had to pretty much know all the games very, very well, so I could, speak to particular spots in any of them. And while I was doing that, I also had side jobs within Nintendo. Like the best one was being an assistant editor for Nintendo Power Magazine, which I very much enjoyed. But the main job was helping people get unstuck. I play Grim Fandango now in the making of the game, and back in the day, one of the developers said he needed to perform a test to make an animation to get a job at LucasArts. What was my work to be accepted at Eidetic? So did I have any kind of test? No, I did not. My test was just really the interview itself, and it was the fact that I had spent, more than anything else, the fact that I had spent so many years at Nintendo. I think I had that job for like 3 years or so. And I had such a huge volume of knowledge about every single game that had come out for every Nintendo machine at that point. And more importantly, I had spent hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours talking to all kinds of players on the phone, finding out what they liked and what they didn't like and what made them frustrated. It was a very unique set of knowledge I had, and I was mostly able to leverage that to be able to get a junior entry-level design position at Eidetic. But no, they did not have me do any tests. Years later, I interviewed at Shiny to work on Enter the Matrix, and they actually had me do a test. We talked about the game and what they were trying to do with it, and then they went off to lunch, and I had to stay and design a level and pitch it when they got back from lunch. And I remember doing that, and I ended up pitching a level that had you kind of like sneaking around in an airport and spending time above ground, but then also below ground. I was kind of inspired by Die Hard 2, and I remember being surprised when I ultimately played Enter the Matrix, because I didn't get that job because they said, "Yeah, you're too high level. You would have to take Dave Perry's job, and we can't hire you for anything less than that." I'm like, "Oh well, why'd you even fly me down here to talk to you?" But whatever. It was fun, but I remember being surprised years later when I played Enter the Matrix and some of the stuff I had pitched them made it into the game. Alrighty, why did we choose Jumping Flash as our target inspiration for making Bubsy 3D? Was the game fully released when you started to work on Bubsy 3D? Yes, it was. I think Jumping Flash, and there was a sequel, Jumping Flash 2, I think they had both come out by the time works began on Bubsy. And it was just, the closest thing the industry had to what a 3D platforming game should be. There were a couple of other games. I remember Gex being a particularly good one on the PlayStation. But Gex was really a two-dimensional game that just kind of faked its way through 3D. And as I understand it, I mean, you have to bear in mind, they had already been working on Bubsy for 6 months or a year before I got there. And so I can't say anything about the initial inspiration for the game. But by the time I got there, they had decided we want to be truly, fully a three-dimensional game. And so that is, and really at that point, on console, Jumping Jack Flash was the closest thing to a real no, it was closer almost to a first-person shooter than a platformer, like a Bubsy-style game. But that's the one they took inspiration from. Alrighty. Before choosing Jumping Flash, how did the development of Bubsy 3D start? Did they start it as a 3D game or as a 2D game? Like I said, I was not there at the beginning, so I couldn't say. But as I understand it, it was always intended to be a three-dimensional game, which was maybe not the best choice because I don't think there was a single person on the team that had any experience working in 3D. Now, back at the time, there were very few people in the industry at all that had experience working in 3D. But if I recall correctly, Chris, he had mostly worked on football simulations before landing. He was the lead programmer, and Mike and Mark, they were the head designers, and they had more of a background. I mean, Mike had designed the original Bubsy, but for the most part, their background was in text-based adventures like Zork. So it was kind of a weird choice for them, but I guess they were just excited. I mean, the whole industry was excited. I remember getting my hands early on, before it was available, on a PlayStation development kit, and it came with a couple of little tech demos, and one was like a Tyrannosaurus Rex that ended up looking like the Tyrannosaurus Rexes in the first Tomb Raider. But when Toshinden came out and Ridge Racer, those were two of the first games that were available. Battle Arena Toshinden, more than anything else, said, "Hey, fighting games don't have to be two-dimensional anymore." And Virtua Fighter had existed before then, but Toshinden really pushed 3D farther than Virtua Fighter ever did. So I think that was always their inspiration. Hey, we're making a 3D game, let's push it as hard as we can. But like I said, I was not there at the beginning, so I can't say for sure. Can you talk a little about the technology you'll use for Bubsy 3D? Why was it so advanced on the market at the time? How did it work? Well, you're better off talking to a programmer than me. I was just a junior designer. With no real industry experience at all. I can say that at the time, pretty much all PlayStation games were lower, resolution. They would do, 320 by 240. And they would rely on the fact that TVs of the time were called NTSC TVs, scan-based TVs, where a TV would only show every other line, and then it would kind of had this kind of blurring thing. It would do line, 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 and then on the next pass it would do line, line. The fact that the games were lower resolution didn't really matter because the TVs kind of smoothed everything out with the limitations of their restriction. I mean, it's interesting, these days pixel art is such a hot thing for games, and games try to replicate old style pixel art. When we played video games back in the 80s, that pixel art didn't look like pixels. The very clear blocks you can see, because now we play all those classic games on high definition TVs. You could see all the individual squares, but back in the day, you didn't see that detail. You just saw something that looked like a smooth character because the TVs kind of blurred everything out. Those were the TVs that we were running on. Incredibly low resolution. They had a tendency to smooth everything out. So pretty much all 3D gaming was really low res. Developers, again, this was a decision made long before I got there, decided, hey, you know what? We're going to be special because we're going to be high resolution. We're going to be 640 by 480, which these days is so low resolution you can't even get your computer monitor to go down that low. But at the time, that was as good as the best PCs. And PC monitors could give you 640 by 480, but no TV ever could. So they decided to have this really high resolution look. That was something that I don't think any other engine was capable of doing. People didn't think the PlayStation could even do resolution that high at the time. Now, the thing is, to be able to be that high resolution, they had to really compromise a lot on view distance and texture detail and all kinds of stuff. And with the benefit of hindsight, it was a bad decision. They would have been much better off saying, hey, let's just be 320 by 240 resolution like every other game, because the TVs will smooth it out and take care of it. And it's interesting, so when we did Syphon Filter, which was our follow-up, we stopped trying to do the super high resolution stuff because it just didn't make sense. But anyway, that I think was the main thing that our engine was capable of doing that no other game was. But in all honesty, I don't think anybody else was trying to do it. I read in an interview, couldn't find it, that I talked to Miyamoto and had help in exchange to make Bubsy 3D N64 exclusive. Is that right? No, that's not right at all. I've never heard that before. Maybe something like that happened before I got there. But no, when I was there, again, which was probably 6 months to a year after they'd started producing the game, we were trying to make a PlayStation and Saturn. Was it the Saturn? Sega Saturn at the time? They were developing on both of those platforms so that it could appear on both. And actually, no. And also on the Jaguar. It was originally supposed to appear on 3 consoles. The Saturn, the PlayStation 1, and the Atari Jaguar. Ultimately, the Jaguar got canceled because that piece of hardware was not capable of doing what the PlayStation, and certainly wasn't capable of high-resolution graphics. And ultimately, the Saturn got canceled as well, so that it only ever came out on PlayStation. But at the time, Nintendo didn't have a 3D platform. Nobody knew anything about the Nintendo 64. That was all shrouded in secrecy. So no, you must be thinking of some other game. As far as I know, that never happened. It'd be really cool if it did, and I think I'd remember it. Because, of course, everybody knew who Miyamoto was, the creator of Mario and Zelda and all that. But no, that never happened. What was most impressive with Mario 64? You, Florian, have read a lot of praise for its fluidity, but there were other things. I'll tell you, the most important thing about two most important things about Mario 64. Both have to do with the controller. And it's interesting. Miyamoto, he's such an important designer that you can have a multi-million-dollar company like Nintendo build an entire piece of hardware to make Miyamoto's game better, because you remember how weird the Nintendo 64 controller was with like the 3 different places you could hold your hands and the 1 analog stick. That analog stick was put in there, as I understand it, specifically for Mario 64, specifically to make Mario 64 as best it could be. This was maybe one of the few times in history where a game console was designed for a game instead of the game being designed to the game console. And so out of that comes 2 things. One is the analog stick, which of course these days is just so standard we don't even think twice about it. But back in the day, that was such an outside of the box idea. Analog joysticks had existed for a long time, but they were pretty much only considered to be necessary for like flight simulators on computers and stuff like that. The idea of replacing a D-pad with an analog stick, that was revolutionary because it gave, well, it's kind of what you're talking about, the fluidity. I think you're talking about the fluidity of animation, but it gave players so much more fine control. It's interesting. I remember Mario did the thing of, well, hey, if you hold lightly on the analog stick, then Mario will slow down, and sometimes you have to do that to avoid the to not wake up the sleeping plants and stuff like that. That's an example of, again, the controller, driving the game and, creating entirely new gameplay the world had never seen before. But more importantly than any of that was the camera, because they had the brilliant idea to make the camera an actual character in the world. It was a little Koopa turtle buddy, and every once in a while, because they said, oh, let's look at a mirror and see the camera, and you are a camera, you're a little character with a fishing pole with a camera at the end of it, and you're flying around behind Mario. And the fact that it was a real character in the world helped players come to understand, why won't the camera move over here when I tell it to? Oh, because it's a real person and it can't move through that wall. It made little noises and stuff like that. Because that game was so influential and it was such a change from anything that had come before, the idea of giving the players control over the camera was just unthinkable. And the idea of, and you could do this because of the analog stick, although it works with a D-pad as well, but not as well as the analog stick, the idea of, hey, you know what, as the camera has to move, the player will just automatically adjust what they're doing with their thumb. At the time, that was unthinkable. If you asked any developer, they would have said, well, no, you can't do that to the player. You can't make all of a sudden, oh, they're pushing left, and now they have to be pushing down to keep on moving west in the game because the camera rotated? That's unacceptable. But it turns out players can make that adjustment really easily and intuitively because they understand the notion of moving camera relative. And, again, Mario 64 I thought was brilliant, the idea that they actually made that was like the first and last 3D game to ever do that. Nobody's ever had to do that since, because Mario 64, was kind of like a gateway between two-dimensional, which is what existed before, through 3D character-based worlds and character-based actions. And, it changed everything, and it was that control scheme. It's interesting. After we played Mario 64, at which point it was too late for us to change anything about Bubsy, and that was heartbreaking. But we immediately realized, oh my God, we could completely change the control scheme for Bubsy to mimic how this works, where the camera is more freewheeling. It's not directly slapped on Bubsy's back. That players will be able to adjust as the camera moves independently. And it works. And we did that. And so, oh my God, this is 10,000 times better. Why didn't we do this? But we didn't. It was too late. Alrighty, can we have a quick word on Jumper, the science fiction game developed at the same time as Bubsy, where you can jump into the heads of robots? Was it a Mario Odyssey style? No. Oh my gosh. I have to admit, Jumper is the game I wanted to work on. When I got the job, I interviewed for Bubsy, and I was happy to get the job. Again, it was my first, professional design gig, which honestly, if you'd asked me 2 years earlier, I never would have thought I'd ever have a job as a video game designer. Because back in the early 90s, it wasn't a thing. There were not university courses to learn how to design video games or anything like that. You just kind of evolved into it. So I was happy to get the job, but I was so jealous of everybody working on Jumper. Now, as you said, it was a game set in a world. It was just so cool. It would still make an amazing game today. I think there have been games that kind of do similar stuff, but I don't know. You'd have to tell me if a game has ever done this. The setting was robots had taken over the Earth. I think they were aliens. It's not like that. It was like an AI takeover. It was like alien robots or something like that. And so humanity was all but wiped out, and there was a resistance. And there were certain members of the resistance who, because of some trick of their brain chemistry, were able to project themselves into the bodies of the robots and take control of the robots. They were jumpers, and so you could jump in and out of robot to robot. And so that was why you were so important to the rebellion. The resistance to save humanity from our robot overlords. And so there were, Terminator style walking around robots. There were tanks, there were cars, there were submarines, there were flying drones, planes, helicopters. And so this was an incredibly ambitious game where, the world was basically controlled and populated by robots, and you would go in, and as soon as you jumped into a robot, and then suddenly you were playing a flight simulator, or you were playing, a character-based action game, or you were playing a driving game, or a tank game like Battlezone, or whatever you jumped into, instantly all the other robots realized, it's not like you could sneak around and live amongst the robots. They all knew, oh no, the robot's been taken over by one of those jumpers, and they would all turn and attack you. So, this game was so ambitious because it was trying to be like 6 or 7 different kinds of three-dimensional games. And I remember I did actually get to do some design work on a couple of levels. And I was designing an assault on a satellite that was in orbit around the Earth. And the first thing you did was, after you had jumped into a rocket ship that you could then control to drive up there, although I don't think that was playable. That would have been like in a cutscene or something like that. But the first thing you did is there were little robots that were outside the satellite that were just doing maintenance. And so you could jump into one of those. And then it was supposed to be kind of like a bumper car type thing where you were bouncing around because you were in a robot that wasn't meant to fight, and you were being attacked by other robots that weren't. So it was kind of like a sumo wrestling match where you were trying not to get knocked off the edge of the satellite by the other little maintenance robots as you tried to work your way inside. And the game was full of really fun ideas like that. And it's a shame it got canceled, but we were working with publisher Accolade on Bubsy and Jumper at the same time. And as Bubsy got closer and closer to completion, Accolade just wanted more and more people shifted over to Bubsy. Because Accolade, I think, was in real financial trouble too. And so they needed Bubsy to come out on time. And so ultimately they said, let's just cancel this whole other thing. And unfortunately, it was very sad. We ended up, I think, half of the Jumper team ended up getting laid off, and the other half moved over to help us finish Bubsy. So in the end, I can't complain too much that I was on Bubsy instead of Jumper, because if I'd been on Jumper instead, I would have had to find a new career. Yeah, that's a little bit about the game. It was really cool. They had some very rough prototypes, and it was, as hard as Bubsy was, Jumper was an even more ambitious game. All right, so I've said in an interview that working on the Saturn version of the game killed the chance for Bubsy to be a better game. Why? Have I said that? I don't know if I said that. Honestly, like I said earlier, it was 3. There was the Jaguar and the Saturn and the PlayStation version. And, well, one thing is, the more resources we would put into those other platforms, those were programmers mostly who could be working and helping out. And, eventually, I remember Greg was the one programmer. There was only one programmer whose job it was to try to get the engine working on the Atari Jaguar. And when it didn't work out and it got canceled, Greg shifted over and helped out with everything else. Or no, I think maybe he was one of the people who got laid off. I don't remember now. It's been so long. If anything, that kind of split in focus is just going to make it harder. I would imagine there were probably decisions that were made in the development of Bubsy where certain compromises were made to ensure, because of those 3 platforms, the PlayStation was definitely the most powerful. Trying to design a game that didn't push PlayStation as hard as it could to ensure that the Jaguar and the Saturn could still run. I imagine, again, before I got there were probably some compromises were made that they didn't have to. I don't know that it really made that much of a difference in the end, quite frankly, if I'm honest. But again, a lot of those kind of decisions were made long before I got there. What was my role on Bubsy 3D as a junior designer? So, by the time I got on Bubsy, Mike Berlyn, who was one of the 2 co-founders of the company, was working full-time as the lead designer, but also as the co-runner of the company. And he was stretched too thin trying to do everything. He had one assistant, Susan, who was awesome. I don't think she ever really did much design, but, Mike, who came from a 2D game development background, would design stuff literally with graph paper. He'd have these gigantic table full table-sized sheets of graph paper where he'd work out where all the bad guys were and how the platforms moved and stuff like that. And then he would give those to Susan, and Susan would use the very simple tools we had to populate and set up all the stuff that Mike had designed. And the two of them combined were not able to get all the work done. So they hired another junior designer. And when I came on, originally my job was to work on the stuff that Mike didn't have time to work on. And those were two things: the bosses and the two-player mode. A lot of people don't remember Bubsy had a two-player mode, and that was like one of the first things I ever designed. That and the calculator boss were my first two things I ever professionally designed. And I'm not saying they're great, but I'm kind of proud of them considering the restrictions I had. I mean, trying to turn Bubsy into a two-player game. It's interesting. There were hints in that two-player game because it was weird. The only thing I could come up with is, there's a sniper chasing Bubsy. And, and again, this was actually before Mario 64 came up with the idea that, the camera is an actual character in the game. So I was like, okay, how can I turn this into a two-player game? Because we cannot have a second Bubsy running around. We just can't do it. The engine couldn't push it anymore. We couldn't do a split screen. But what if, you and I are sitting on the couch, you're playing Bubsy, trying to survive, trying to get through the level, and it's a competitive game. And anytime I want, I could take control of the camera and shoot you, because I was a sniper trying to shoot you. Or I could take control of the camera at a really tricky spot that would make it harder for you to jump from one platform to another, because I'd try to stop the camera, and then I'd try and shoot you and all that. And that was literally the best thing I could come up with the restrictions we had. We should have been smarter. We should have recognized, hey, you know what? When the camera suddenly breaks free from Bubsy, the Bubsy player is still able to move around. Maybe the camera can be independent of Bubsy, and maybe we can have a different control scheme. And if we had pursued that a little bit more, maybe we would have been ahead of the curve, ahead of Mario 64 with its camera controls. But we didn't, because we were in a full-on panic just trying to get the game done. And we're like, okay, this ticks the box. We promised Asmodee we'd have Accolade, our publisher, we'd have a two-player mode. It's a two-player mode. It's there. And, so after that was done, and then I just worked on bosses, and eventually, because the game is so huge, I started doing some design on the later levels, figuring out where the platforms go and where the bad guys are and stuff like that. But, I only came in for the last 6 or 8 months of development. They had done most of the development long before I ever got there. But that was my job as a junior designer on Bubsy. When you, Florian, played Bubsy, some things impress you. Placing rocket ships on the main path to show it's important to collect, arrows to point directions to other stuff. How did you elaborate the general game level design? One of my theories is you tried to replicate the game design that was in a 2D game. Was Crash Bandicoot also a certain direction to follow, referencing to more straight line levels? Here's the deal. You got to remember, Crash Bandicoot, much like Mario 64, Crash Bandicoot came out when it was way too late for us to do anything. I remember we were looking at Crash Bandicoot and said, oh my gosh, this is a three-dimensional game, because Crash Bandicoot is really a 2D game, much like, what was I talking about earlier? Gex the Gecko. We had, up to that point, we were like, no, we're doing real 3D. We're not doing cheap 2.5D. There's another game, Pandemonium was another neat quasi 3D, but really a 2D platformer on the PlayStation. And we're like, we're better than all these. We're doing real three-dimensional stuff. We're not going to compromise on that. And, you look at Crash Bandicoot, we should have compromised. We should have gone low res. We should have just put you in a little tunnel. And so suddenly we could have had our engine could have totally been capable of doing the exact stuff Crash Bandicoot was. But again, we thought, no, we're real 3D. We're not fake 3D like these others, and we'll be rewarded for it. We were not, because, of course, Mario showed the world how to do it right, and Mario came out before us. And it was too late for us to do anything about it once we saw what Mario was doing. It's interesting. Mike did all of his design in 2D. He literally had gigantic pieces of graph paper that were then transposed. Me, when I started doing it, I actually kind of did design in 3D. And I don't know if that means the later levels that I was working on maybe had a different feel because of that, because I was kind of designing while I was building the level rather than doing all my design and then trying to put it in 2 dimensions and then put it into the game. Again, I already mentioned, right? Nobody at the company had any experience with three-dimensional gameplay. Very few people in the industry as a whole had three-dimensional experience. And we were just a small group of less than 20 people. We were not the entirety of Nintendo behind it. And we made choices, or I should say, choices were made because, believe me, when I got there, I was like, we really should change some stuff. But by then, it was like, what do you know, kid? You're brand new. You don't have any experience. And besides, even if we wanted to change, we don't have time. Just go design these bosses and just help us finish the levels. And, it was always just a full-on crunch, a full-on terror trying to get the game done. Not knowing the big wall we were about to crash into. I mean, Bubsy was a hugely ambitious game. Bubsy was an open world game almost long before such things existed. The levels were gigantic. So, yeah, I don't know what to say. But yeah, definitely it was a game made by people with 2D background experience. And me, who had no experience at all. Alrighty, continuing. You found by playing it, that verticality is very important. Are you right? Why do you decide that? Yes, that was the whole thing. It gets back to the fundamental philosophical decision that was made early on. We were not going to cheat. This was going to be a fully three-dimensional game. And that means the Z-axis, going up and down. I mean, when I came in to interview, they showed me, I forget, it was like the third or the fourth level. The beginning of the level, you were jumping around. You had to climb up some palm trees, and then you were up on top of the palm trees jumping around. At the time, I remember being blown away. It's like, wow, I've never seen anything like this. So trying to find a way to climb up here, and now I'm up here, and I'm really getting a sense of vertigo. Like, I don't want to fall and whatnot. And it's not, I mean, I had played Jumping Flash. I knew what Jumping Flash was. But Jumping Flash was, you're just basically on a floating island, just kind of moving around and doing basic shooter stuff, and occasionally making these big jumps, these big, huge, slow jumps. Whereas Bubsy was fast, and there were bad guys all over the place shooting at you, and you're having to duck under the shots. And then you're trying to climb these trees, and it's like, wow, this is amazing. I've never seen anything like this. Because, of course, nobody had seen Mario 64 yet. But yeah, I mean, again, it's just part of the overall philosophy of the game. True 3D, no matter the cost, no matter what we have to compromise. Talking Bubsy is one of the main complaints characters deal with. I'm not sure, but I think it seems Bubsy teaches us game mechanics at the beginning of the game. Was that the main goal? It was really Mike Berlyn, who was the lead designer, co-founder of the company. He was a huge fan of old classic Looney Tunes cartoons. I mean, you can see every time you die or the little cutscenes between, we're just trying to capture the magic of Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck and Elmer Fudd and all the rest of it. So Mike really wanted Bubsy to be the kind of like this wisecracking, fast-talking, street-smart character like a Bugs Bunny. And at the end of the day, it whiffed. I agree. It's terrible. It's a shame. There's no way. I don't think you can actually turn the voice off. It's not the fault of the actress who plays Bubsy. She was just following her stage directions. And honestly, we just said, okay, look, we're just going to trust that Mike knows what he's doing. I mean, Mike was a successful writer. He had some stuff published, and he was very passionate about it. And we're like, okay, this is Mike's thing. He wants funny voices and whatnot. But you're right. Bubsy, I guess, was kind of ahead of the curve because, it's interesting, prior to this time, tutorials were unheard of. Games did not do that. Game design back in the 8-bit era and the 16-bit era, they expected you to read the rule book because they didn't teach you anything in game. They just said, hey, just go and just figure it out as you go, no matter how complex games were. And so, the fact that we've spent was it just the first level or maybe the first couple levels? It's been so long, I don't remember. We had those floating question marks. And we were like, okay, we were already making Bubsy talk anyway because Mike really wants it to have this kind of Bugs Bunny Saturday morning cartoon feel. Hey, we can use this talking because this is a really complicated game. No one's ever seen anything like this. We're using every single button. We should really teach players because they're not used to having to look around in 3D and find their way to climb up palm trees and stuff like that. The industry's never done this before. So we thought, okay, yeah, let's teach you how switches work. Let's teach you how gliding works and all the rest of it because it was a very complex game. Jumping, then if you held long enough, you went from a jump to a glide, and you had to be able to glide to get over, really long chasms. And there was a lot of complex stuff. If anything, I would say ultimately Bubsy had a more complex overall set of moves than Mario did, or at least base Bubsy did. Of course, Mario you can get different power ups and stuff like that, and with the flying and whatnot. No, don't get me wrong. Mario's better in every way. But, and honestly, with the benefit, I mean, there are so many things that you look at now and you say, oh my God, what were they thinking? Why didn't they cut this and this and change this to that and all the rest of it? But you have to remember, nobody on the team, programming, art, or design, had any experience working in 3D. We were all figuring out as we go. And the industry really didn't have, I mean, if we had started working on Bubsy after Mario 64 had come out, it would have been a completely different game because we're like, oh my gosh, this shows how to do it and it works. We should totally make it like this. We could do that. Instead, we copied an old holdover. I don't know if you remember Flashpoint. It was a PC game that was a predecessor to Tomb Raider. Remember, don't forget, the original Tomb Raider's controls were more like Bubsy controls. We were copying the Tomb Raider controls too, where, hey, up made you move forward and left and right made Lara Croft turn in place left and right. And the camera always stayed stuck on her back, just like we did. That was the way 3D was done. And we're like, okay, well, we're not going to reinvent the wheel here, when we should have. And Mario 64 did, and they were successful because of it. Did the Bubsy 3D team was an experience? When you when you do a search for the team on Moby Games, see a lot of inexperienced devs making it. Yeah, totally. Yes, it's funny you asked that because I've mentioned it several times. Nobody had any experience doing this at all. So the best we could do was look at what is state of the art in 3D design, and that is Jumping Flash, and that is Tomb Raider. And we wanted to be, we were a much more 3D game than Tomb Raider was. As an example, Tomb Raider is largely a two-dimensional. There is some elevation, but nowhere near as much as Bubsy. We didn't know any better. I certainly didn't. Like I said, I was, gosh, I don't know. I'd have to look it up. Probably 25. 26 maybe. It was my first job in the industry after having been a Nintendo gameplay counselor for all those years. Yeah, we were figuring out as it went. We were an undiscovered country. Past teams worked on Bubsy 2 and 3, hated the character. Was this the case on Bubsy 3D? That's a good question. I know we were all a bit nervous about the voice. I think that was the main thing. We were like, ugh. And don't forget, while we were developing it, we could turn the voice off. We didn't have to listen to it while we were working on the levels. So we didn't hear it as much as the end players do. So I think we were all just like, look, we're just going to trust Mike. It seems like this is kind of annoying, all this voice stuff, from this like really, hey, what do you think type thing. But yeah, we just didn't listen to it while we were developing it. One of the ways I was able to get my job is because I had actually played the heck out of Bubsy. Remember, I was a gameplay counselor, which meant I had to learn all the ins and outs of pretty much every game that came out on the NES and then the Super NES. And Bubsy was one of many, Sonic clones. Sonic the Hedgehog radically changed the industry. Sonic the Hedgehog did, and then Mario 64 did. But, when Sonic came out, everybody had to have their own Sonic clone, and Bubsy was the Sonic clone for Accolade. And it was a fairly well-received game, and I had played it all the way through, and I knew it pretty well. And so, when I interviewed, I was able to talk about, well, here's what I think Bubsy does better than Sonic. And, I kind of buttered up Mike, and I showed how I had a really solid understanding of the character. But, yeah, I guess... Yeah, I don't remember there ever being like, oh, I can't stand this little bobcat. I mean, I remember... I had a fondness for Looney Tunes cartoons too, and I really enjoyed the silent death movies and when he wasn't talking, when he would just shut up. I think if 90% of Bubsy's voice, if he had just been saying something like "yeehaw" when he got an extra life and just a few simple little things, it probably wouldn't have been so bad. But Bubsy talks a lot, especially in that opening tutorial level. Which again, remember, tutorials were not a thing. If I could go back in time and exercise, well, I mean, if I could go back in time, there'd be so many things to fix. I mean, that would just be one of many things. But yeah, it didn't really affect us because I think we all kind of had a fondness because he was a cute little bobcat and we had fun little animations and whatnot. He had big eyes and all of that. I remember, on the loading screens were all silly puns. One of them was mine. I think it was for the calculator boss. They all had pun names, and I came up with the name Mortal Bobcat. And to this day, my wife and I, and this is like 30 some years later, still okay say Mortal Bobcat. Dun 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 dun. So no, I don't recall anything like that. Maybe other members of the team felt differently, but I don't think so. I was one of the harshest with Bubsy 3D regarding the quality but I didn't explain in an interview about that. Well, first of all, if you're talking about, there was an interview I did with somebody where I don't remember. I mean, I did this years ago, and they really quoted me out of context and made me sound really angry. And they used the quote, I'm too old for this shit, or I don't have time for this shit, and I'm quitting and stuff like that. And here's the deal. If you could go back and listen to the original interview, I was joking around. I was not angry, but they repurposed the quotes because they read the quotes instead of using the audio of me. They make me sound angry and bitter, and I'm not. I'm not bitter about. I'm grateful to Bubsy because it gave me my foot in the door. They took a chance on me, and honestly, at the end of the day, considering the restrictions we were under, I'm proud of what we came up with. I know for a fact, I've seen, we got lots of letters, and to this day, you can go to, any video of Bubsy 3D, and you'll see the vast majority of comments just dunking on it and saying what crap it is. But there is no choice about it. You will always find plenty of people saying, I loved this game when I was a kid. I played this game with my dad when I was a kid. I played this game with my kids when they were kids. And there is love for this game out there. If you, compare it to what we have today, or if you compare it to Mario 64, it doesn't hold up. But it was an ambitious game. It did a lot of stuff. It did a lot of stuff well. It had a lot of brilliant ideas that would have worked better in a two-dimensional game, quite frankly. So, yeah, I'm not bitter at all. I will certainly criticize it. I think there's a lot of problems with it, obviously. But no, I'm proud of what I was able to do. I'm proud of the team, of what we were able to do. An incredibly small, plucky team of people with no experience, just putting on the best show they could. And yeah, we got destroyed by one of the most experienced teams in the world, where millions were spent to build hardware to make the game possible. We're not going to compete well with that. But no, I don't think I'm angry or bitter or harsh. Yeah, obviously, I'll critique it as much as anything else. There's a million things you could do. Honestly, and the sad thing is, a million little things you could do to make it a lot better as well. But it doesn't matter. It is what it is. What did I think of the game critics when the game released? To talk to developers, lots of them know their game drawbacks when they were released. Was that the case? Yeah, I think we knew. I don't think we expected we were going to get, literally EGM, Electronic Gaming Monthly, to say, this is the worst video game in the entire history of video games. That was really rough. Because it doesn't live up to Mario, but there was so much love poured in, and we worked as hard as we could. We did as much as we could. Nobody played that game more than us. We were experts at it. I could pull off stuff with Bubsy that makes him more, adroit than Mario. The way you can move around and stuff like that. We knew. We did not realize how bad it was going to be. We thought, this is not going to be good, because, we'd seen Mario. We'd seen Crash. And we were like, we have made a series of mistakes, but our publisher, Accolade, is out of money, and they're saying, you have to publish this now. If they could have given us another year, right? And we're like, oh my gosh, look at all this. All right, let's drop the high resolution stuff. Let's not make the controls camera relative rather than character relative. So he's not a tank anymore. He moves around freely. Let's stop doing this camera popping. Let's cut out all of this dialogue and go back and re-record and have Bubsy not talk as quite so much and not try to be quite so funny. We cut down the resolution, so a regular resolution. Now we can put a lot more detail. We can put plants and we can let's make the bad guys bigger so you can see them. Let's make their projectiles bigger so you can see them. There's a million things we could do. And if we'd had another year, forget about it. I think that game would be very fondly remembered as, it wasn't as good as Mario 64, but after Mario 64, we were really excited to see something else like it, and it wasn't bad, and it did some cool things. Like you mentioned, I think it was great the way we said, okay, to heck with it. Let's just put arrows around so players don't get lost. Instead of a mini map. Little things like that were really good. And again, that sense of vertigo you'd get the first time you climb up the trees, and the fact that the Bubsy could catch ledges and pull himself up on them. That was way ahead of the curve. That he was smart enough to do that. Give us another year. When we could learn lessons from Mario 64, that game would have been amazing, or at least well-received, instead of literally referred to as one of the worst games of all time. But, hey, it is what it is. Like I said, Accolade was in trouble. They needed the game to come out, and it came out. Talking about resolution, why you decided to make the game high res? Was it impossible? No. It was easy. We didn't have to do it. And, because that high res meant, here's the deal. People don't actually play real Bubsy anymore. They just play emulated versions of it now. If you go back and look at the real Bubsy on an old TV from 1993 or 95 or whenever the game came out, I'd have to go look it up. The game looks much better because the TVs had a softening effect. And plus, in all the emulated versions of Bubsy that everybody has now, there's no fog. Whereas in the original version, if you actually had a real PlayStation 1 and played the original disc on a TV from 1992, the fog has it feels more like fog. It has like this soft, so it's like, oh, this is just a really foggy planet. You can't see very far, but still, it sucks. The whole point of the design of the level was you were supposed to be blown away because you could be standing anywhere and see for miles. And, when we ran on the development kits that had extra memory and had, stronger hardware, when, the levels were designed to be able to, stand up on some platform and see, oh my God, there's the gate. It's way over there. It's across 3 rivers and there's a rocket. And how am I going to get over? Oh, and I probably have to go through that jungle over there. It was amazing. But then the real PlayStations that didn't have all that extra memory and the extra hardware couldn't handle it. So, mistake. Rather than redesign the levels so they'll work well with our actual shipping hardware that people have in their homes, we just brought that fog in. And suddenly, one of the coolest things about the game, this sense of scope, of epic scale. You know how these days you play Red Dead Redemption and you stand up on a cliff and you look out, I can go to anything I can see, I can go to. We were doing that with Bubsy. Yes, it was much more primitive, but it was game-changing at the time. And it just turns out, oh yeah, the hardware couldn't handle it. Rather than just compromise, because we didn't have any time, we just had to live with it. It would have been much better if, okay, well, you know what? Let's go on ahead and design with these levels in mind. What can we do that would be better if we can't actually show you a map that looks like it goes on for miles in every direction and you can go to all these places, which was very, very cool, but, it just didn't live up to it. That's why it is easy to get lost in the game. You're like, I don't know where to go. Oh, thank God there's an arrow. But originally, you're supposed to be able to know where to go because I can see the arch. It's way over there. And I can see that gigantic electric monster. How am I going to get past that thing? But I want to go over and check that out because I can see it. It is what it is. Right, Florian, I found some footage from E3 96. Oh, I'd be curious to see that, where we see a much more agile and good-looking background. Was the resolution responsible to slow the game and make the background more messy? Was the game on was it the game on music side? I don't know what you mean. I am gonna go. I'm gonna open up my browser right now. I would love to see that myself. Well, I can't find it, but man, I did just watch a bunch of just video from random stuff in E3 1996, and man, that took me back. And I was once again reminded of just how. Don't forget. That was E3 in 1996. That was like, what, May, June, July, sometime like that. We came out like 2 or 3 months later. And it was only, after seeing Mario 64 for the first time along with everybody else in the world there. And there's like, oh my God, I can't believe this. We're doomed. We're dead. We're dead in the water. Can we change things? No, we can't. All right, well, we'll just do the best we can and get this thing finished. But yeah, if you could find that video, I would love to see it. And I would comment on it. We know that you made a prototype for a potential Bubsy 4. Bubsy 4D, because remember, it was going to be a time travel game. So it was all about 3D and 3D, then we're going to be 4D. We're traveling in 3 dimensions plus the 4th dimension of time. Wasn't that going to be clever? By search, I have the most fluid gameplay possible, close to Mario 64. But what Bubsy 4 look was it? Did you plan some levels, game mechanics? No, we didn't get very far. Because, basically, once we saw Mario, And it was too late. We were going to ship like just a few months after that, and there was nothing we could do. We're like, okay, let's just get this done, put it in the box. But tell you what, Bubsy 4D is going to be amazing. It's going to be absolutely incredible. What the team did is we switched over to let's start developing a prototype for what Bubsy 4D could be. And so we could show it to Accolade, and oh, too bad Accolade doesn't have the money. They're not going to support this. But then we were able to take that demo on the road and show it to every publisher until eventually Sony said, wow, that's a pretty impressive demo. And you folks have really been through the ringer. I guess you're ready for Syphon Filter, aren't you? So the Bubsy 4D demo, it was one level. It was using it was using all the same characters. It was the same Bubsy model, the same animations. It was Woolies again who were, shooting at you, making all the same sound effects. It was a volcano, where what was happening is the entire level was a gigantic volcano. And there was a path running around the volcano, and there were like lava things coming down, and you had to, that's why there were platforms, because there were rocks coming down. You'd have to jump, and you'd have to fight past the woolies and stuff like that. And you could move around freely, and the camera wasn't tied to your back anymore, and it was just doing some simple smart stuff to always let you know which way you were going. And and that was pretty much it. It didn't like have an end. It didn't have cut scenes or anything like that. It was just a proof of concept to see, look, here, take this controller. Here's the amazing thing. Mario 64, to be as good as it is, you need that analog stick. Don't forget, the PlayStation didn't have analog sticks. All we had was the D-pad. And so we had to work hard with this quickly thrown together prototype to make the D-pad feel as good as an analog stick, and it felt pretty good. It worked okay. And that was pretty much it. And that's what we were working on after we'd put the final gold disc in the mail, and the game had to be mass produced and shipped out to stores and all of that. And so we're like, okay, let's stop thinking about that, because we're not gonna do very well, because everybody's gonna love Mario more than us. But hey, let's just all eyes focus on Bubsy 4. That's gonna be amazing. Other than just the idea of, hey, we're gonna travel through time. I believe that volcano was supposed to be Vesuvius, Mount Vesuvius erupting and all of that, because it was, you'd gone backwards in time and the woolies were causing chaos in time, and so you had to fight them and make sure history went the way it was going to go. But we never really got very far. It was mostly just a technology demo to prove that we could do it. And ultimately, it's what got us the Syphon Filter gig. Mike Berlyn thought about retiring after Bubsy 3D, but did stay on the boat. Do you know why he decided to stay? No. I mean, you have to remember, at this point, Mike Berlyn he must have been in his 50s, I would assume, maybe late 50s, early 60s, and I was still in my mid-20s. I was fresh out of school, no real experience. Mike and Mark Blank, the two co-founders of the company, they'd been making video games since the late 70s. Since I was like 8 years old. So I respected Mike, and I considered Mike to be a mentor, and I still remember one of the most valuable moments of my professional career ever. I don't remember what it was, but I was pitching Mike on, hey, we need to make this change to do this, so this can become this thing instead, right? And I couldn't tell you what it was. And I went into his office already. I had all my arguments made, and I was going to, really make a big impassioned speech and all that. And I got, I don't know, like 30 seconds into it, and he said, okay, you've convinced me. And to me, that was such a powerful moment, that he would listen to me, even though I had no experience, didn't know what I was doing. But he would consider me enough of an equal to take my ideas on board and change his own mind about stuff. I thought he was a great guy. I knew him and his wife, Muffy. My wife and I, we had dinner at his place one time. And he was just a sweet, charming guy with just nothing but story after story after story. I can't imagine what a blow it had to be for him personally, because of course, when you're told that, hey, you made the worst video game of all time, well, heavy wears the crown. It's not like it's my fault. I was just a junior guy. It's not like it was the animator's fault. Everybody loved the animations. It's not like the coder's fault. They did the best they could, and they delivered what they were supposed to. But Mike, he had to bear it all. He was the director. He was the lead designer. He was the heart and soul of the game. He created Bubsy originally for the Super Nintendo. And at the time, the original Bubsy was considered to be a Sonic killer. There were a bunch of other fast talking animal games, but everybody said, oh, Bubsy is the best one. And so it was I can't even imagine how heartbreaking it must have been for him. But kudos to him. He just picked himself up and got back to work. right? And so he was originally the lead designer on Syphon Filter. And he had certain ideas for what it should be. And he was not crazy about making a super hyper-violent game and stuff, because ultimately, and once he was gone, oh man, we went crazy with the violence and the blood and the setting people on fire and watching them scream in agony and terror. He would have hated that stuff. And me, I was just a kid in my mid-20s. I thought, oh, this is so funny. This is so cool. And of course, to this day, I mean, people still love that kind of stuff. I was more inspired, by Mortal Kombat. Hey, can we get that kind of feel into? And he would have wanted nothing to do with that. I remember in the early days working. It was interesting. John Garvin, who ultimately became the creative director of Sony Sony Bend, or formerly Eidetic. He became the creative director after I left. He and I kind of shared, we were like co-creative directors, me focusing on design, him focusing on the art and presentation, and we were like a good team. In spite of the fact that we were constantly butting heads with each other all the time. Looking back, I would say we were a good team, and we both stood up to each other and pushed for our corners. And when I was gone, he took over and became the creative director of the company, right? But anyway, he was just hired to be the lead artist on Syphon Filter. I think he came at the end of Bubsy. He was there kind of for the end and helped maybe with Bubsy 4D a little bit, but he was mostly just there starting out with Syphon Filter. And John and I saw eye to eye immediately, and we were both very simpatico. Me, the junior designer, and him, the new. John was the only person who really had any experience making a 3D game, because he had done some kind of mech RTS game at Dynamics. I don't remember what it was, but so he had at least had some experience with polygons and stuff like that. Although who knows, maybe it wasn't much more than us by the time we finished Bubsy. But he and I just really gelled. We both saw eye to eye. I want to do this Hong Kong, John Woo type stuff. He loves X-Files and likes dark, moody conspiracy stuff. We're like, oh my God, these two things will work well together. And did you see the movie Assassins? We need to make a game like that. That would be incredible. Where we could be an assassin, but we're with assassin with a heart of gold. And he was like, and so we saw eye to eye, and Mike didn't want to do any of it. Mike still wanted to have humor and whatnot. I think Mike was more interested in kind of like a silly, spoofy spy thing. True Lies was a big deal, and that was a spy comedy. And so, at one point, Lian Jing, before she ever became female, before she became Asian, before she became the character she was a guy who literally sat out in the van and spoke into your ear, and his name was Guy Vanoff. And I believe that was Mike, because he thought it would be funny. Hey, let's call the guy in the van, let's call him Guy Vanoff, because it'll be funny. And I remember he had he said, Gabe always, no matter where he is, Gabe always wears sneakers. And I think he was thinking of the old Tom Hanks movie, The Man with One Red Shoe. And he thought that was just kind of quirky and interesting and odd. And me and John, we were like, no, we're serious and gritty and stuff like that. And there's just, at some point, early on, within the first few months of Syphon, Mike decided, okay, I've had enough. And it wasn't just this. It wasn't just the, frustration over what happened with Bubsy, constantly butting heads, because John and I became like a tag team. The two of us just kind of beating him down, saying, no, let's make it more gritty. Let's make it more realistic. Let's not do silly stuff. But I think there were other things going on too. There was behind the scenes turmoil in terms of ownership rights. And I don't even know what all was going on with that. I've heard rumors throughout the years. I'm not going to say anything because I don't know the particulars, but I think as much as anything else, it was that kind of stuff that pushed Mike out. And he probably would have still been a trooper. It's just there were business conflicts that he ultimately decided, you know what? I am literally too old for this. And I'm going to go off and start a company, and I'm going to develop ebooks. And of course, today, ebooks, with Amazon Kindle and all that, are just normal. This is how people read books now. But back in the mid-90s, or the late 90s, the idea of, oh yeah, I read all my books digitally, electronically. Unfortunately, he decided to go make a career and a company out of that. And he was about 10, 15 years too early, unfortunately. And I'm not quite sure what happened to him after that. But I think he was just a trooper. Like I said, I started by saying this. I was still just a young kid. He was the old mentor. It's not like we were friends or anything, and he would hang out after hours and tell me what was really going on. After Bubsy 3D, I was the lead designer on Syphon Filter. What Bubsy 3D teaching me in what did Bubsy 3D teach me in design and team gestation? Well, Bubsy taught us a lot about what not to do. But here's the deal. I did not look back at Bubsy. at the end of the day. I mean, I imagine I probably took some lessons from it, but for me, I guess if anything, I learned, hey, you know what? If you're going to, base your game around the way other games work, pick the right games, right? Because at the end of the day, Jumping Jack Flash works because it's a first-person shooter that just kind of does a little bit of, that does some neat platforming stuff. And so I thought, oh, well, it works here. Let's make a three-dimensional game. It's so annoying every time you jump in Bubsy how the camera pans up. But if you look, it's doing the exact same camera pan that Jumping Jack Flash did. But it was important in Jumping Jack Flash because you were a first-person character. If you didn't look down, you couldn't see yourself. And don't forget, we didn't have dual analog sticks. Players could not look down. So the camera had to do it for you. In 3D, Mario proved you didn't need to do that. Players can see where you are. All you need is a little circle on the ground to kind of get a sense for where you're going to land. Syphon Filter, right out of the gate. I mean, in part because we were kind of still comfortable. Well, it's interesting. We did so much experimentation with controls. When did Tomb Raider come out? Did Tomb Raider come out while we were working on Bubsy? Or I feel like it came out when we were working on Bubsy. I'm pretty sure that's the case. I was aware. Here's the interesting thing. When you play Syphon Filter, the original Syphon Filter, we still have the character relative controls, where left moves the character, rotates in place, up makes you move forward, down makes you move backwards. Same thing as Bubsy, same thing as Tomb Raider. And we're like, okay, we experimented a lot with, hey, we did this Bubsy 4. What if we just make the camera free like Mario 64 all the time? Right? Let's do that. We went back and forth on that so much. And ultimately, we ended up on a compromise. The main controls are kind of tank-like, right? Just like, Tomb Raider, because more Tomb Raiders are coming out, and we felt this is what people will expect. They won't expect Mario 64 controls in a game that feels more like Tomb Raider. So let's stick to this. But as soon as you hit the target lock button, then all of a sudden, Gabe moves around freely, and it suddenly becomes character relative controls. And we ultimately, because we just could not, we did focus tests, and it was never 100% clear which way should we go. So we kind of just hedged our bets and went with both. Syphon Filter copies from Tomb Raider and from GoldenEye and from Mario 64. In terms of its a raw gameplay, it's those three games. Then with my own flourish, the target lock, which I invented. And unbeknownst to me, Miyamoto invented it at the same time for Zelda, which we wouldn't see until much later. And of course, he did it slightly different than I did, but whatever. Oh my gosh, Tomb Raider came out right around, first release was 1996. Jeez, came out right around the same time as Mario. No, I still remember while we were working on Bubsy playing Tomb Raider, right? I know that was the case. But anyway, so Tomb Raider kind of said, hey, no, this is the rule for realistic character control. That Mario stuff, that's for cartoony stuff. And so that's why we're kind of a hodgepodge of different things. I was still a young kid. I had very little responsibility. I mean, I was responsible for some level design and a couple of features, and gave some, the whole idea of grabbing onto the electrons and letting them go and it'll explode if you hold on too long. That was me. Literally, in the first meeting of my first week, coming in, and I was just sitting. They were having a meeting, and they were like, "Okay, we're going to try and figure." They had all these atoms all over the place, and they really liked the idea that, oh, well, you know what? At that time when Bubsy touched an atom, it just zipped off in the direction Bubsy was facing, and it was really cool. They liked the idea that the atoms would do chain reactions, and one atom would hit another, but they found it very frustrating to make happen, and they were trying to figure out, well, how should we do this? And I'm like, well, what if you just have Bubsy grab onto the atom and and then aim and then let go? And while he's aiming, he'll start shaking violently because the power is building up and it'll explode in his face. And that was literally my first contribution, because everyone said, yeah, we could do that. And that worked. That was an example of, right, we have something. How can we make this work? It's not like what I imagine the way it works, working on Mario 64, these big games where, hey, you know what? Let's just spend 2 or 3 years experimenting and figure out what works best. And now that we know the game is great, let's make the game. That's not what we did on Bubsy. That's not what we did on Syphon Filter. We were trying to figure out what actually works at the same time that we were making the game. And that's not the right way to do it. But that's how I ended up having to do it for the majority of my professional career, quite frankly. It's a great question, and honestly, I don't really think I have an answer, because Bubsy 3D was not mine. Syphon Filter was mine. And I was taking lessons from other games I had played. I've said in an interview that the final sentence of my video on Bubsy 3D That I'll always take pride in Bubsy 3D. Why would I be proud of the game? I'm proud of the game because I'm proud of the people I worked with. I know how hard it was to do. I was there, and everybody was working so hard and doing the best they could within the restrictions they had. And I think there is a lot of really cool stuff. There's a lot of cool ideas that would go on to become very normal. But we were ahead of the curve in a lot of stuff. I guess I could be ashamed. I don't want to live my life being ashamed of the game, so I'm proud of what I did. I'm proud of that silly little idea I had for how to grab onto the atoms and let them go shooting off. I think that's one of the more memorable parts of the game, because it means you have control and you can create these kind of chain reactions. I mean, it didn't work out as well because it was supposed to be, you notice how a lot of times there's like a lot of atoms all over the place, just scattered around? That's because what was supposed to happen is, it's going to be so cool when you shoot one atom into two and that one hits four, and then next thing you know, boom, like 10 woolies are taken out because of the explosion of all the atoms flying all over the place. Kind of like when you're playing a game of pool and you hit it so hard and all the balls go flying everywhere. That was the intent. I'm not quite sure why that didn't work out because, again, I was the junior designer. I came up with an idea of, hey, well, here's how you could make it so you could aim the atoms, and they ultimately did that. And I'm proud of that because I think it works okay. It's not great, but it's about probably the best thing you could do based on the circumstances we were in at the time. And so I'm proud of solving that problem. Finally, I think this is your last question. You've read previously that I had a great relationship with Mike Berlyn. Why was he so important? Did you meet him again afterwards? Did you have any final words with him? No. As I recall, I want to say when he left, he went to Florida, so I never saw him again. And as I understand it, a few years ago, he was actually running a GoFundMe to help fight cancer, which just made me so incredibly sad. And I don't even know what the situation is with him now, in all honesty. I hope he's okay. I hope he went on and had a good rest of his life. I think he stayed married to Muffy. He loved her so much. And I think that's amazing. I think that's an incredible accomplishment that very few people can claim. Living happily ever after with the people you love. He was important to me. I told the story earlier. The first time he said, "You've convinced me," was so empowering for me. That he would listen to me. That he would implement what I was doing, even though I didn't know anything. It was a very special relationship. He was a mentor, and people say the guy who made Bubsy 3D, that's the worst game of all time. That'd be the worst mentor ever. But no, he really taught me a lot about how to work with people and how to listen to people and how to just be a good person. So I've got nothing but nice things to say about Mike. Yeah, and that was certainly one of the highlights of my time working on Bubsy 3D was working with Mike.